"Roger's in the break room again. Pass it on," I whispered as I passed Julia's cubicle on my way back to my section. Julia rolled her eyes and sent out a group email, omitting Roger, of course. Passing another of my coworkers named Bob, I thought back a couple of days when he interrupted me in the conference room. At the time, I was making a really good point about the new dress code policy, and everyone was paying attention to it. Bob interrupted to ask a question, and before I knew it, everyone was off in another direction and I was left seething just a bit. I'll let Bob get his coffee in the break room. "Marcia?" Don, my supervisor, stood near my cubicle, and I sat down trying to straighten my paperwork. My desk was always a mess while I was in the thick of the workday. I glanced up at him and smiled. "Yes, Don?" "Marcia, there's a rumor the new guy Roger is, what's the most tactful way to say this?" He looked around the office for possible eavesdroppers, then lowered his voice even more. "Well, I've heard he's not too sociable. Shoot, I've heard he's just plain disagreeable. You have a pretty good instinct for people. What do you think?" I pretended to give it some thought, picking out a staple with my fingernail and trying to smother a laugh. "The thing is, Don, as long as he's meeting his work deadlines, it doesn't really matter if he's disagreeable, does it? This isn't a social club. If you're not happy with his work, you're the boss. Tell him." In spite of Don's ears turning pink, he handled this slight rebuke pretty well. But we've worked together for 14 years, so I know just how far he can be pushed, and we weren't even close. As I watched him walk back to his office, I thought about Roger's first week here at Strine and Simmons. We'd assumed his habit of constantly talking about himself was just insecurity, and it would eventually wear off. We were wrong. He'd been here 6 months now, and he never missed an opportunity to turn the conversation back to himself. If Jack and Harold were talking about boats, Roger would walk up and look like he was really listening to the back-and-forth banter. As soon as a sentence ended, he'd start talking about what he'd done in his last job, or where he'd gone last weekend, and then he'd ramble on for as long as they'd let him. It happened every day, every break or lunch period. I tried asking him one time about his family. It was like talking to a brick wall, like he didn't even hear me. No pause, no hesitation. He continued on with his monologue about what a great job he'd done on that last project, in spite of a couple of problems, but he'd pulled it off and it was just fantastic, and how everyone was so pleased with the results. On and on. I think if he ran out of material, he just found alternate ways of saying the same thing again and again and again. Within 2 weeks of his starting work, people were actively avoiding being in the same room with him. It didn't matter. Roger had no problem with hijacking other people's conversations. That was the evening I had the idea. What if we just let him talk? What if we actively encouraged Roger to talk? But more importantly, what if we didn't let him stop? The next morning I got to the office early, eager to lay out my strategy to Don and see what he thought. Roger loves to talk. He's an expert, you might say. Why shouldn't we take advantage of his, expertise? I was trying to convince my supervisor, who wasn't so sure about my brilliant idea. I think I was whittling down his objections, aka winning him over, because he was making little sounds of approval. They may have been chortles covered up by coughs, but a win is a win. That afternoon we all got the email. Don had scheduled a session in the conference room for the following morning, gave a brief outline of the specific case, and called the staff in one by one in person to clue them in. At 9 a.m. the next morning, everyone was seated around the conference table with notebooks and steaming coffee. Don introduced the case we were working on and invited comments. As soon as Roger interrupted with, "Well, at my last job, I tried," we knew we had him hooked. Everyone had been instructed to stay silent when Roger was talking. If and when he stopped, we'd all been given a list of questions to ask him to get him going again. Lunch was ordered in, salads and sandwiches eaten at the conference table, with questions aimed at Roger, who appeared to be enjoying the event immensely. I have to hand it to him. That boy did love talking about himself. Around 4:30 that afternoon, Don concluded the session. I think we've got some good ideas thanks to Roger's considerable experience in these matters. Roger smiled smugly at no one in particular. However, I think we still have much to learn from him. I've still got questions. Anyone else have questions? Lengthy pause as dismayed, everyone immediately grasped where this was heading. Therefore, I sincerely believe it is in our best interests to meet again in the morning to get those questions answered. A new list of questions was circulated, and the next morning the session, began promptly at 9 o'clock. Julia and a couple of the other girls were beginning to show signs of boredom, but they bravely carried on. The guys had a bet going on as to the specific number of the word I that Roger would utter that day, so they were carefully taking notes. At one point, Mark did a fist pump, caught himself and smoothed his hair back, glancing quickly around the table. Around 2 o'clock, Roger began picking up his water a little more frequently and clearing his throat. Did he notice that he'd answered the same question no less than 5 times? He also began taking longer pauses between sentences. Julia had almost forgotten her part and nearly dropped the ball a couple of times. If Roger stopped talking, she was supposed to say, "That was fascinating. Could you give a little more detail about that?" And then take copious notes as if hanging on every word. She was actually working on her grocery and to-do lists. Between the 8 of us in the room, we managed to keep Roger talking for 2 straight days. At the end of day 2, Roger's voice was audibly hoarse. But Don wasn't through picking the poor guy's brain and decided that what was needed was a recap on day 3, which was Thursday. Thursday morning, we sat uninterestedly at the conference room table, none of us looking forward to another long day listening to Roger. Come to think of it, Roger didn't look that happy himself. We've heard some good ideas over the past 2 days, thanks to Roger. He paused and led the group in a round of applause. However, I believe what we need at this point is for Roger to address the group without the use of questions and just sum up his thoughts. Roger, you have our attention. Don sat back down, and the group looked expectantly at Roger. Roger cleared his throat and looked at his notes. He opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out. He cleared his throat and took a sip of water. Still, no sound came out when he opened his mouth. Don asked him if everything was okay, and Roger just shook his head. Roger, why don't you take the day and make an appointment to get checked out by a medical professional? Let's give this a day or so and we may pick back up on Monday. Everyone filed out of the room. I stayed behind to close the door. So what do you think? I looked up at Don hopefully. I think we've just wasted most of the week on this harebrained idea is what I think. He shook his head in disgust. Well, I don't. I think we made progress. I really do. Let's see what tomorrow is like, okay? Roger's mother called in the next morning to report that he wouldn't be coming in, as the doctor diagnosed laryngitis and recommended he not return to work until at least Monday. On Monday, however, Roger sat at his desk and mostly kept to himself. About a week later, he sent in his letter of resignation and assured everyone that although he would miss being in the office, he'd decided to focus on writing his memoirs and would be taking a break from the corporate environment.